My name is Nichols. I'm the host of the Red Pilled Fiction Factory. And tonight's episode features a US author called Noble Brown, who's from Arizona. And he's written a book that's in the fantasy genre, The White Feather. Good evening, Noble.
Evening. And actually, the book is The White Arrow.
Sorry, yes, that's right.
We're referring to the fletching, but no, it's the...
Yes, no, that's right. I'm thinking of another... there's a famous film that's on my brain. Sorry, The White Arrow, correct. Would you like to introduce yourself, Noble, and tell us where you're from, your background, what you do, and so on?
Sure. So I live in sunny Phoenix, Arizona right now. I have for most of my adult life. I was born and raised in Maryland in the DC metropolitan area. And, my day job, I do information security. But I've always wanted, I'd always wanted to be a writer. And so that was I guess you would call it a side hustle that I pursued for as long as I can remember. As a kid, my father owned an insurance agency, and he, had, a pool of secretaries that would work there. This was just before computers kind of became a thing in the 80s. And he worked really hard. He would periodically, he'd work on the weekend, and after a while, when I was about 8 years old, from that point forward, every now and then my mother would be like, could you just take him with you to get him out of my hair for a minute? And so I'd go with my dad to his office, and I don't know if they thought it would be a great idea, because like, what is a kid going to do at the office, But I thought it was the best thing ever. So I would make my own newspapers while he was working. I would sit down at a secretary desk and start hammering away at the electric typewriters, and then I'd photocopy dozens of copies of them, and I'd sell them to everybody I knew for a nickel or whatever. My parents were very good at indulging that little hobby of mine. And I read a lot of comic books as a kid. I a lot of different novels and in various fiction genres. And then when I got older, came out to go to school here in Arizona, and after I had started my career in the early mid-90s, I still had the itch, to write, and I thought I might want to be a journalist, a newspaper or magazine writer. Pursued that for a while, and I had a editorial column in the Arizona Republic, the East Valley Tribune out here. I had bylines in a number of magazines, and I came to the conclusion after a few years of really hustling after it that there was no way to make any money in it.
Okay.
So
what sort of articles were you writing at that time? Just
whatever,
straightforward reportage?
I would do features articles for the magazines, which was fascinating. I got to do a lot of cool stuff with that. I could interview pretty much anybody I wanted and pitch it to the magazine and say, hey, there was a magazine here in Arizona that I really liked working for. It was called City AZ, and they're defunct now. But in the 90s, they were kind of a big deal. It was a big glossy magazine, and they liked to feature local artists, entrepreneurs, businesses, people of interest, whatever. So I could call them up, and say, hey, this guy, lives here. Can I go interview him? And they'd be like, yeah, sure. If he's set it up, tell him you're doing the thing for the magazine, and we'll send a photographer over the whole bit. And they were really cool about it. And one of the best interviews I did, I got to interview Todd McFarlane, because he lived in the Valley. I think he still does at the time. So I got to visit him at his home office. It was right about the time he was about to release he had done a music video for Pearl Jam for their single "Do the Evolution" or whatever. And it was right before he bought the baseball that Mark McGwire had hit to set the home run record. I mean, it was a lot going on with this guy at the time. So it was a fun interview. But I interviewed all kinds of guys in the business of whatever. I interviewed the guy who was the owner of a motorcycle company called Titan Motorcycles out here. I interviewed the CEO of a steel company. It was fun. I got around. I met a lot of people. I talked to a lot of interesting people. I wrote editorial articles. I didn't do a lot of actual just like straight in-person reporting, um, but I wrote just about everything else that you can imagine.
Well, it's all good practice, isn't it? Writing a
No,
book needs skills that have to be honed at some point.
yeah, no, you definitely learn a lot about, what the industry expects as far as, okay, this is your formatting, this is your, this is the kind of language you want to use, that kind of thing. So it was all good, but it just, most of these things would pay me between 50
Yeah.
and $100 a job, and it's like, that's great, but I can't eat off of that. So so did that for a while, and then decided if I was ever gonna do it again, it would be more deliberately my own thing. And so I focused on my career for a while, but I had the idea in the back of my head for a novel for the longest time. And I never really bothered to scratch the itch until a few years ago. And what I had done is kind of my punch in the face that, like, okay, I need to go do this, was I had I've been playing a lot of World of Warcraft.
Okay.
And I didn't really like the competitive gaming part of it. Like, I'm not good at it, but I liked the story. It's a fantasy role playing game. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid too, so it was kind of right in that genre. And I love the story of it. I was like, okay, this is really interesting and engaging. They've got thousands of years of lore to play around in, and so I would write fan fiction on this forum that I was a member of. And at first, it was just sarcastic, ironic garbage. But then I would add a post to this story I was writing about once a week or so. And after a while, people really liked it. They're like, hey, when are we going to find out the next thing that happens with this character? Blah, blah, blah. And at one point, I sat down after I'd been working on it for like 2 years. And I compiled all of it. And I had an 80,000 word story.
Is that right? Oh, that's a painless way to write a book in a way, because
Well,
if you
it
sit
is,
down and set
but
out
it's
to write 80,000
right.
words, it's horrible.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like, I'm like, okay, great. I can write an 80,000 word story, but I can't publish this, because it's World of Warcraft. It's not my IP. Yeah. It's not my story. I mean, I'm using characters that are in,
right,
the game and all that stuff. So it's like, that's awesome, but what if I had actually used that for my own story? Why didn't I just do that this whole time? And so that was sort of the light bulb moment for me. Was like, okay, I can obviously do this, and lots of people really like it, so I need to stop doing this and start working on my own stuff. And that's kind of where, I sat down and said, okay, let's look at all these. I have a shelf full of journals that I was taking notes in for, ideas for this book. And there's so many ideas. I just went through, and I did National Novel Writing Month, actually. This was.
Can you explain what that is to us non-Americans?
I thought it was international. I didn't realize that.
I don't know. I haven't heard.
No, it's fine. It's great. I don't know either. I'm not like that into it, other than, so I got on. I was online, and other writers are talking about, oh, I'm doing this. They call it NaNoWriMo, like National Novel Writing Month. Like, it's a terrible acronym. But like, they were using this hashtag, and I'm like, so is this a thing? Like, people write a book in a month? They
I have heard of that. Yeah.
So they take the month of November, which is a terrible month to do it, by the way, because you've got Thanksgiving, you've got the holidays. I don't know what they were thinking picking November, but they did. And so, I sat down and looked at it. I'm like, okay, so what do you have to do? And they said, well, you write 50,000 words in the month of November. You upload, you copy and paste just the raw text of your book. If it matches the word count and it doesn't appear to be any other person's writing, then yeah, you win. and you don't get anything except for like a JPEG file to put on your profile or whatever, but you're a winner. And so I was like, all right, that might be the level of accountability I need. So I sat down and wrote The White Arrow in that month.
Fantastic.
And I did it about a year before it was actually published. And so what I did was I wrote it, and then I told myself this has got to be just hot garbage. I didn't touch it for almost a year. And then the year afterwards, National Novel Writing Month rolled around again. I'm like, okay, I'll do this. This will be the rewrite. And it was easier that time because I'd already written it.
Yeah.
And then I went through, I literally had it printed out on one side of my desk and my computer here, and I rewrote it, and I would just edit as I go, kind of thing. And it came out to, a little more than 50,000 words and all that stuff. I didn't really take credit for winning the event that year, but I got it done, and then I ended up.
Well, I think that's their main intention, isn't it? They're not expecting people to have come out with a masterpiece, but they are hoping that it will inspire them to realize their potential and get something down.
And that's why, like, I rushed it to get it onto Amazon. I didn't hire an editor, and I should have, because there's stuff in there. I read that book today, and I'm like, oh God, like the end of the book. There's a scene where, I don't know if you remember, but Iris leaves the underground cavern, and she goes to get her horse. And then I read the book now. I realize that she lost her horse like 2 chapters earlier.
Don't worry, we're all guilty of.
And I'm like, wait a minute, she doesn't have a horse. Little stuff like that. There's typos
Details.
in it and stuff. But I know, but it bothers me. Like I look at it, I'm like, I could have done so much better with that. So, but what it was is that I had this urgency to get it out, and not only get it written, but get it published, even if it was just doing the self-published route, because then it would feel real to me, and then it would feel like, okay, I am a published author, even if it's self-pub, I don't care. Right. I have a copy of my novel in my hand, and so I know I can do this. And so so that's what I did. And that's a long way to answer your question there.
No,
basically that's how I got there, was thanks to my parents being patient enough to buy my papers as a kid, my dad being patient enough to let me just wreck his secretary's desk on the weekends. And, it was, that's kind of what it takes is you got to just, have people around you that embrace that crazy love of writing that you have.
Yeah. Now you settled on the fantasy genre. I understand now why. I don't read much of it other than the sort of classics of the genre like Tolkien and stuff.
Sure.
But that's clearly where you settled. I'm going to give a little, I think I got it off your website, just a brief introduction so that the listener might get an idea of what the book involves.
Right.
The White Arrow. The third age of the Western realms has been marked by a great conflict in the East, but now the danger has come to Lyria, and the largest of the old kingdoms is in open rebellion. Follow the stories of several unlikely heroes as they battle forces in a fast-paced tale of epic fantasy filled with mystery, intrigue, and suspense. And that's also that raises the point. There are several protagonists in the novel, aren't there, going their own way. We don't get it from one point of view. We get it from quite a few. Would you give a rough idea of expanding on that introduction, how the plot develops, the main characters, and what the goal is?
So the goal was and remains, you'll notice through reading it that a lot of these characters don't actually interact with each other. And there are a lot of characters in the book, and that's one of the pieces that I get for people is like, can you create like a glossary of all the characters and who they are? Because I can't keep track of them. And I'll be honest, like I have trouble keeping track of them sometimes. And I'll be working on the second book, and I'll be thinking, wait a minute, have these people ever met before? Because a lot of it was written with the idea that there are these unique characters that I want to exist in this world, and they all have a purpose for the greater story. And so I want to make that interesting, in that, okay, this person's going to do something that is significant, but I want people to know that they didn't just come out of nowhere to do this. Like there has to be a story to how person A, got to be the one to push the magic button to make this happen or whatever. I don't just like to have some random character show up and be like, well, where did that come from? So, and though there are a lot of people that, are in the story and, their job is to maybe just die a horrible death at some point, but that's okay. Like I've told their whole story and, okay, well, wait a minute, that's not the payoff I was looking for. And I got some feedback about that, about a certain character that, we went the whole book talking about, and then, well, that person's dead now. Wait a minute, that's not what I was, hoping would happen.
You are quite ruthless, aren't you, with your...
Well, I think that's, but the only reason why, well, two reasons. One, some of the authors that I really admire are authors that do that, and they bully their characters a little bit, but I realize that the best authors do that for two reasons. One is when you put a character in a perilous situation, the reader doesn't believe that they're in peril if there is not like a permanent consequence periodically. So when readers read my book and I put somebody in a perilous situation, you're like, oh my God, this person could die here because I've killed off, characters. Like, okay, this person could actually die. So I need to be vested in do they get out of this?
Yeah.
Whereas if your characters always somehow survive, that's great. And I understand I love this character and I don't want to kill them type attitude, but every now and then somebody's got to die. So that's part of it. And the other thing is, like, I was reading a lot of Jim Butcher novels at the time, and he just beats the hell out of his characters.
Can you explain who? I don't know him. Again, I'm sorry.
So Jim Butcher wrote the Dresden Files, and it is like there's like, I don't know, he's got to have 15, 20 of these damn books now, and it started out as it's modern day Chicago. The guy's a private detective, but he's a wizard.
Okay.
And so he solves normal crimes, but mostly he solves supernatural crimes for people who can't just go to the police for this kind of stuff. Like, oh, there's an actual demon that's haunting my house. I need help with that kind of thing. So he has all the rugged kind of pulp fiction tropes of what a private detective looks like, but he's a wizard.
Background, yeah.
Yeah. And so and his protagonist and all the side characters, they suffer tremendously throughout these books, but not in a way that doesn't make sense. I think there's a certain level where you get a little too gratuitous with it. Like, I'm not in the George R.R. Martin camp of, hey, let's slaughter everybody every 5 minutes, but you do have to make it realistic. Like real life is not necessarily sunshine and roses all the time. Your character has to grow through some adversity, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just die. So that's where I got that. But I've got characters that appear in the White Arrow where their payoff is not until the sequel that I'm working on now, and their payoff is not until a book after that. And the intent is to write at least a trilogy, but there will probably be more. Because the world that I've built is not what it seems. So there's going to be some weird stuff
layers upon layers.
Yeah, again, this is what happens when, like, you spend 15 or 20 years of your life, filling up notebooks with ideas of, okay, this is what I want to do, and you can't cram it all into one book. I mean, I guess you could try, but I'm not in the 800-page novel business, so.
No.
So, and that's the other reason. That's the other kind of thing with my writing style is you mentioned, writers like Tolkien, which I've got all of his books. I've read most of them. I don't do the level of exposition and description that he does. My stuff is very chop, one thing right after the other. I let the reader kind of fill in the gaps as far as, okay, what does this all really look like? You can imagine that in your own head. I like to have a fair amount of action in a quick pace, because in the books that I like the best, that's what happens. There's not a lot of when I read Tolkien and I get to the part where he's he's got a character singing a 4-page sonnet or something. I'm like, okay, skip. I don't need to hear all that.
Sure.
Like, that's great. And there's no disrespect on Tolkien. He is easily one of my favorite authors, but like the dude has so much detail in some of this stuff. And I'm
Well,
like,
he
okay,
was a professor at Oxford, and he did have an incredible
he was a
time.
genius.
Yeah, and he was a
Yeah.
genius. I think he was
I,
untouchable almost.
yeah. And so like I said, it's not, I got to play to my own strengths. I am not going to
Sure.
be that level of good with it. So I have to stick to what I'm good at, which is let's just keep the story moving. So that's how I wrote it. And
The setting in my head, from the way I interpreted it, was quite Scottish in many ways. I don't know if that rings true with you. That some of the names were slightly Scottish. It just had a sort of medieval Scottish.
so that was the intent, is that
backdrop.
each culture has its own, is rooted in a real world culture.
I see.
So the northern people, from like Northwood and Coth and so forth, they're all based on Scottish, British, Irish. I mean, which is basically my background. And then you've got the Lyrians are supposed to be more Germanic. That kind of thing. There's other races that get introduced in the next book, a lot more, and there's some that will be Nordic. There will some that will be Asian. There will be some that will be more Roman/Italian. There's going to be a Greco, Athenian type race. I mean, there's all kinds of. I think, I'm not trying to sort of recreate the wheel here. I want the characters to be relatable and recognizable to people, and so by doing that, it's, it helps it be easier for somebody to grasp. Okay, this is why this person is this way, because he's obviously like an angry Irishman or whatever. Like, okay, that trope fits, and that way I don't have to explain that to somebody. You just know, like, okay, so somebody with that name, they're obviously like that because that's how they are anyway. So,
Okay.
So yeah.
Now you mentioned Tolkien and a couple of other influences. Are there any other major writers that you either recommend to listeners or that you have influenced you?
As far as trying to imitate writing style, I really like Ernest Hemingway. Obviously, he has an economy of language, but also a brilliance of language that is just impossible to replicate, but we always try. But I actually grabbed a book off my shelf in preparation for this question because not a lot of people know who this guy is. But this is Joel Rosenberg. And
I've read one of his books, actually. Yeah, go on.
There's two Joel Rosenbergs out there, so you got to be careful. There's one that does like suspense type thrillers, and there's the fantasy author. So this guy writes fantasy books. He's the more obscure of the Joel. There's Joel C. Rosenberg, who is the more famous one. So this guy, I picked this book up like in the 80s when I was young, and I was fascinated by it. And the whole premise of this book is you've got these college students that get together to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons. But they don't call it that in the book because it's copyrighted, right? But it's basically that's what they're doing. And the dungeon master is one of their professors, but this professor is actually like a wizard, and he has the ability to see things in another world that's like a parallel universe to our world. But it's a medieval fantasy type setting, and he can see it and he can influence it, but he can't enter this world himself, but he can send people to it. And so he starts these people on this adventure, and when he has the right group of people together, he actually sends them into the adventure that they've been playing all this time. Okay. And so these people have to find their way out. Like there's a way out of this, this fantasy world that they've been sucked into. And that's the whole story, is like, okay, how do we find our way back home? And to me, that was fascinating because you're taking like real world stuff, but fantasy stuff, and how do you mash them together in a way that kind of makes sense? I mean, we know it doesn't, but okay, I can suspend my disbelief enough that like, okay, this is how a Dungeons and Dragons universe could exist in our universe if it was just some sort of weird parallel dimension type thing. So, and again, this guy wrote several of these books in this series, but he also wrote several other books that are similar but not the same. And I was a big fan of his work. And he passed away some years ago. And I was always kind of irritated by it because I thought I wanted more. You know, I would go to this was before the internet, right? I would go to the bookstore and I would look in the fantasy section under the R's for, okay, is there another Joel Rosenberg novel out there? And then once every year or so, I'd find one. And then we had the age of the internet, and I looked him up online, and he wasn't writing as much. Ironically, he lived in the Minneapolis area, and you talk about red-pilled writers. I mean, before anybody called it the red pill, this guy was he was spending most of his time teaching concealed carry classes and teaching people how to navigate the legal system to, obtain firearms legally, and because he was a big Second Amendment fan and all that other stuff. And I'm like, and when I frame that in the context of what I read in his books, I'm like, oh, I can see that now, because there's a strong kind of, it comes out, but you don't think about it.
Right.
And so to me, that was hugely influential, because I realized that the sort of subliminal message can be sent through a work of fiction that doesn't even exist in the real world, but you can absolutely get that point across if you tell your story in a compelling manner. And he did. So, it's really good stuff.
Very good.
And I'm a huge fan of his books, and rest his soul. I really wish he had an opportunity to write more, but he didn't. So, my biggest influence that maybe not everybody has heard of would probably be Joel Rosenberg. But the ones that you have heard of, I was a huge fan of Chris Claremont's work in the X-Men when he wrote those comics in the 80s. Huge fan of Ernest Hemingway, Winston Churchill. I'm a huge fan of his writing. Just his style of writing. He tells a story.
Sure.
And a lot of historians don't like his work because it's like it's too pro Churchill. He tells he tells history in the way that makes Churchill look the best. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but don't we all? But he tells a story in such a way, and he has such a mastery of the language that I sit down and I read his stuff. I can't put it down. Because it's such a good, captivating way that he tells a story.
Yes.
And I know you have to take it with a grain of salt, because it's like, all right, this is Churchill's perspective, but still, it's a good story.
Well, also, what better person to tell their version of the story than the guy who was at the forefront all the time and at the head of the Allies and so on in the Second War? No, another genius, no question. And in the Tolkien vein, the two of them.
Well, and the other thing, I love that he wasn't an early riser, and I'm not, and he would get up and just smoke cigars and drink booze all day, and I'm like, that's okay by me.
I was going to mention your bio that appears on your website, or is it on Twitter where I found you, mentions you enjoy good books, cheap cigars, and Irish whiskey.
Yeah, that's still true. I've got a humidor full of cigars right here on the desk, and I'm looking at the liquor cabinet now. But yeah, Irish whiskey is still my favorite, and I'm all about finding a good cheap cigar, not necessarily cheap, but if it's a good cheap cigar.
Good value for money.
Yeah, so
I'm going to read a little extract here. It's the opening passage from the book to give the listener a flavor. It's got my favorite character, John Gibson, features him. He starts the novel off. John Gibson crested the low hill, unslung his quiver, and took a seat on a fallen tree trunk as he caught his breath and surveyed the Lyrian capital in the distance. He had been running for miles, determined to make the city before nightfall, and paused to drink from his canteen and plan his approach. Bridgewater was under siege, with the southern district before him occupied by rebels who had set a number of buildings aflame. He grabbed a handful of earth and filtered it through his fingers. The soil was much darker than the tundra of his homeland. Weeks of travel had taken him further south than he'd ever imagined going. He brushed his hands off and considered his options. The mission was clear: find a way out of the castle, which sat on an island in the middle of the river that bisected Bridgewater, convince the royal family to flee into exile. The archer rubbed his sore calves and muttered to himself, "Getting in is the easy part. Convincing that daft king to leave is the real problem." Very nice, and it carries on very much in that vein. John Gibson survives at the end, doesn't he?
He does.
He's one of
This
the
book
lucky ones.
anyway.
In this book, okay.
Yeah.
Now, go on.
Gibson, I rewrote him a number of times. I hated his character the first iteration I did of him, and I hated that chapter. For whatever reason, my biggest struggle was writing the opening chapter, and once I got past that, everything else came real easy. But that was the hardest part for me, was always that opening line, because I'm stuck with the notion that you have to kind of grab the reader with your first couple paragraphs, and if you don't, they're going to put the book down and not pick it back up. That was
not alone. Everyone goes through that, I think.
That was the hardest. That was the single hardest thing I ever wrote, was what you just read, and I still don't love it. Like, could I have done that better? Like,
that's okay.
But no, Gibson, I rewrote him. He had a totally different name when I started. I didn't like his name at first. I didn't tell enough of his origin story in the first version of the book, and then I inserted a whole section later in the book, kind of as a flashback, to give him more backstory, to make him more interesting. And it was the section where he's a kid, and his village is under siege, and he has nothing to fight with but a bucket, which was a joke at the time, but I ended up leaving it in there. And so, I went through a lot of pain with that character. I almost killed him in that book because I was like, I just can't stand this guy, because I didn't like what I was doing with him. And as you can see through the book, he goes through he doesn't have an easy time of it. And so now I kind of like him, but it's not going to get any better for him in the next book. But some of his stuff in the next book is some of the best stuff that I've got, as far as where the direction he's going in. He's got to do something else, because at the end of the White Arrow, he's no longer a White Arrow. He's no longer an archer. He's gotten kicked out. And, he kind of thinks, well, I could go back to that. I could go, back to Northwood and beg the king to get back in, because he's kind of redeemed himself. Everything that he kind of screwed up, he made right. But he doesn't want to. He makes, this is kind of his character development. He decides, okay, I'm going to do something else, and I'm going to go down this other rabbit hole that I found along the way. And so that's how the book kind of ends, is that he goes down a totally different rabbit hole. But that's very important, because it places him where he needs to be in the grander scheme of things. And, when I talk about how all of these characters, they don't necessarily interact with each other immediately, but at some point you're going to see why they're all important. They all have interesting stories. Don't get me wrong. They're not gratuitous. You don't read them and think, why is this guy here? He sucks. Like, no, they all have cool stuff that happens. But it gets even better as time goes on, because then you start to see, okay, I've watched this character who I thought was just nobody, but he did something cool in this book, and then he got bigger and bigger and more important. And a lot of these guys are going to have backstories that are going to blow your mind, because it turns out they're more interesting than we thought they were, or they're going to go through something that's going to make them more interesting as time goes on. But that's a careful path to tread. One of the things that I dislike in some of the novels that I read is that they have especially fantasy novels are really, they fall into this trap all the time. But even Harry Dresden, in Jim Butcher's novels, had this problem, is that if you have the same character that you're following in a world that you've built all this time, you have to keep throwing bigger and bigger stuff at them, And so after a while, it's like, okay, all right, now my character's defeated the god of death. What does he do next? Okay, what do you do? I don't know. No. What do you? So you have to either kill them off, or you have to find something bigger to throw at them. And so I don't want to get caught in that trap. That's why there's so many characters, because they don't all get to carry this load. Like, not one guy is going to save the world here. It's going to be the act of a collective of characters. They're all going to do their little bit, but every little bit actually counts. Like Iris Shockley is not like a super powerful person, but she's one of my favorite characters in the book because even though she does her own thing, it ends up being part of the grander scheme and being very, very important. But it doesn't feel like it at the time. When she does what she does, like she's doing it for her own motivation. She doesn't do it because I'm trying to save the world. I'm doing it because I'm pissed off at this person or whatever, you know? And so she does her thing, but it ends up being extremely important in the grand scheme of things. And that's going to continue. Like, you know, and one of the other characters I threw in there, Oliver Happ, I had a lot of fun with, and he was just a nobody, you know, but because he stands up at the right time and doesn't just run away in the face of danger, boom, he becomes important. You know, now do these people get to be super powered and you know, defeat the god of death or what? No, nothing like that. You know,
They play a role.
Yeah. I mean, the guys that I have in the book that are like really, really powerful, I try not to let them do too much, you know, because then that's not interesting to me. You know, like, okay, Superman is like the worst character in the comic books because what do you throw at him? You know, like they've tried to kill Superman. They've tried all these things. It's like, all right, great. If you don't have kryptonite, you're screwed. Superman's going to kick your ass. So, you know, you don't. It's just very, very difficult to have a character like that. So I want to make sure that in this world that I'm building, there's lots of characters, but there's also like somebody can die and then somebody else can come along. You know, like we're not stuck in, okay, this person has to be the one to save the world. But we are also not stuck in, okay, this person needs to go from level 1 to level 150 and in order to save the world either. Like, no, you can be an average dude and do your part and still contribute to the saving of the world, but nobody does it by themselves. That's kind of where I'm going with it.
Got it. We haven't talked about the red pill side of your fiction. It doesn't come out terribly in the book, and the novel deals with major issues that are eternal and infinite, if you like. But so we'll put that to the side for the moment. You personally, how did you become red pilled, and what's your background in that sense?
So, I guess the qualifying question I'd like to make is what do we mean by red pilled? Because there's a lot of different schools of thought that have sort of adopted that euphemism. You know, and the origin for the term red pill for me goes back to the movie The Matrix, where you wake up and you realize the world is not what you think it is.
That's right.
There's other stuff going on here, and you need to make sure you know what's real and what's not. I would say there's not a moment, you know, like a lot of people, for example, that are in the school of Christianity, and I consider myself a born again Christian. You know, they say, well, there was this moment, like, you know, what's your story? And I'm like, I don't really have a moment. It was more of a process, and part of it is because of my upbringing. Like, you know, my dad was what you would call pretty red-pilled when it came to stuff like, you know, he didn't trust politicians, he didn't trust the media. You know, he would always talk about how the newspaper is all garbage and how, you know, the biggest problem we have in this country is, you know, judges don't have to be reelected and we don't have term limits and stuff that, you know, nobody would really talk about, you know, like they don't teach you this stuff in school, you know? And so my dad's perspective on things was always a little bit different than what the mainstream was. But obviously I have tremendous respect for my father. So it's like, okay, well, maybe I need to pay attention to what he's saying more than what this high school history teacher who looks like he can't bust a grape in a fruit fight, you know, who do I really trust here?
Yeah. Good.
So it was more of a process for me. And as time went on, I started to realize that it's still like, I don't think anybody has it all figured out. I mean, there's a lot of theories out there. It's like, okay, how deep does the rabbit hole go?
Yeah.
I would say the biggest, if I had to point to a single moment in my young adult life, it would have probably been around the time of the 9/11 attack. And, you know, everybody was upset about that and everybody wanted to, you know, go out and punch somebody in the face over it. And then I saw what they did with the Patriot Act, and I was like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
like what does like free wiretapping have to do with all this? Like if you like due process and all this other stuff, like
Mm.
something's, and then all of a sudden we had all these new expansion in government power, like the Homeland Security and TSA didn't exist before 9/11. And so you just created two new branches of government in response to this. And I'm like, that seems like an overreaction.
Yeah.
And then we start taking our shoes off, and I'm like, what? Like,
And still are.
yeah, yeah, it's just, so I started scratching my head over that. I was like, wait a second, this doesn't smell right. And obviously anybody with an ounce of sense looks at it and says, yeah, this was kind of a bad idea, that the single greatest expansion in government in history after World War II was after 9/11.
Yes, and now we know that 9/11 wasn't quite as straightforward
Yeah.
as we're sort of,
Yeah.
so it all adds up.
It
comes
really,
across. Sorry, I was
yeah.
going to say, for the listener, I know that you're red pill because of your Twitter account, so it comes across clearly there. Very good.
Yeah, and I've made it pretty clear that all the stuff we've seen post COVID-19 is very, very similar to what we saw after 9/11, and that's my biggest concern. Is the tremendous, I understand everybody wants to feel like they're doing something helpful, but that was the same excuse a lot of people used after 9/11, and then it's like, okay, but are we a little concerned here? That there seems to be a lot of liberties that are being restricted in the aftermath of this crisis that maybe we need to reconsider.
And if some of the rumors are right, we're only just starting to realize the full scale of the repression that's coming. But hey, we'll leave that for now.
Yep.
What is a sociopathlete? I think it's your handle on Twitter, isn't it? Or
yeah. So I have
I love the term. I just don't know what it is. Sociopathlete.
So I have two Twitter accounts. I have the one that's just for the book. So if people don't want to necessarily get all my other nonsense and they just want to hear about the book, it's at Noble Books. But at Sociopathlete is the one where I do, for lack of a better term, most of my
commentary,
shit posting.
Yeah.
But I've it's interesting. I came up with the idea. My fiance were sitting around the dinner table, like we wanted to come up with an idea for a company, and we wanted to be kind of like athletic, fitness related, and so forth. And I always thought it was fun to sort of make up a word. Like made up words are great because they're easier for you to make your own and kind of trademark because the word doesn't exist. And it's even better when it's a word that you mash together out of two other words. And so if you're going to be like an athletic type, we were going to be a T-shirt company. And so, but like, okay, what is an athlete? Like, well, everybody has like a savage athlete type thing. Well, like, what about a sociopathlete? That, it got clever. And so, but then I decided, okay, now I need to actually make it mean something. And so I've kind of cultivated what I call a school of thought around it. And I refer to sociopathleticism as the philosophy of successful barbarians,
right,
through history and legend. And this is another book project that I have, although I haven't made any real headway with it. But the idea is to tell stories of through history or legend. In other words, like I can use an example that's not necessarily nonfiction, but to tell the story of, okay, this is what a successful barbarian looks like, because all major changes that come into civilization, it's usually an outside influence that does it, and to the status quo, it seems barbaric at first.
Yeah.
Everything. The Romans were seen as barbaric to all the people that they conquered, but then everybody just kind of adopted their way of life because, oh, this is a more successful way to do things. Like, and so that's what I think. A successful barbarian looks like is not one that just is barbaric for the sake of being barbaric, but is contrary. And so, and if you think about what a sociopath is, and it has a very negative connotation. although some people have kind of grown a little more accepting of the term with the popularity of like the Sherlock Holmes TV shows that they've been doing lately, where like Benedict Cumberbatch is oh, I'm a high functioning sociopath. I'm like, yeah, exactly. That's what somebody who is not necessarily compliant with the ethics of society.
Yeah, you could almost say red-pilled.
Right, but they do.
I'm sympathetic to that, and
but
it's a much more nuanced category. There are some good sociopaths, and people like Churchill, to a degree, must have been sociopathic themselves. Right. I mean, to go against.
The point is, it's not that they don't have a moral compass. In many cases, most of them have a very reliable and predictable moral compass. It just doesn't jive.
It won't let them flicker away. That's very interesting.
So that's kind of where I got off with it, is like, okay, so these are the people that are really good at this.
Yeah.
Like an athlete, but it's like a mindset at the same time. So again, it's a made up word, so it's my made up definition.
I use in my own novel, I adopted the concept, the cultured thug. I call my character a cultured thug, which is along the same lines. Basically, you do need thugs in this world, people who do the dirty work.
Men of action.
Men of action who are prepared to, kill or die. But hopefully, the cultural part means that they're doing it for the good of the, not just the selfish, destructive, nihilistic reasons. It's more of a, generous gesture.
Some of the best and most interesting characters in history, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, are your cultured thug types. That's a great trope, because you think of like the Godfather movies.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the Corleone family, they're nothing but cultured thugs. They can dress up nice and they're classy for the most part, but then if you run them the wrong way, then things get violent. But
that's right, and there are always going to be thugs, pure old thugs. So you're going to need a cultured version to stand against them.
Yeah, you need one that you can count on.
That's right. So you've mentioned you've got plans for the second art or novel. You've got a title, I think, for that, haven't you now?
Yep. It's The Widow's Wrath.
That's right. Great title.
And it's widows plural, because at the end of the White Arrow, there's a number of widows, which I didn't. That's how I came up with the title. I was like, okay, what do we have in common here, and what is going to happen in book 2 that is part of this common thread. And so the widows of book 1, obviously they get angry and they do some things, but that's not all there is in the second book. But that was just kind of the catchy title that came to mind, because there was a common theme there. And there's actually there's a few widows that are obvious, and there's one or two that are not so obvious. But when they're revealed in the book, you'll realize, oh yeah, I remember that being mentioned in book 1. So yeah, there's.
And so you've started that, or how are you getting on?
Yeah, it's easily probably 75% done.
Wow.
For the first draft, anyways. It's a lot longer than the first book. It'll probably end up being twice as long.
Okay.
Because now that I kind of broke the seal on, getting a novel written, I realized I could do it, and I realized I didn't have to be as frantic about it. There's a greater degree of confidence now that my book's on Amazon, people are buying it, it's great. Now I need to do better for the second one. But I can have a little more fun with it, I think, is kind of how I'm approaching it. I'm doing things that are totally off the wall with this one. But I'm doing the things that I want to do to get to the end point that I'm trying to get to. So by the end of book 3, it's going to be mind-blowing. Like, oh, so this is why this world is the way it is. Like, all will be revealed, sort of. Okay. Not all, but you'll have a better idea of why things are the way they are. Book 2 is going to hint at it a lot more than book 1 did, and it's like I said, it's a really good time. And I opened it with a new character, but he's also an old character. I basically took the character that I wrote in my fan fiction, and I rewrote him, and I put him in book 2.
Okay.
Because I enjoyed him so much, that I was like, okay, I'm going to take this guy out of the World of Warcraft universe. I'm going to drop him into my universe, but obviously he's going to have a different backstory and all that other stuff. But he's still going to be the same character, but just in a different skin, as it were. So, because I didn't want to include that character in the first book because I wanted to make sure I could detach myself from that, and I wasn't just regurgitating something I'd already done. But now that I've gotten that again over the kind of over the dam, as it were, I'm having all kinds of fun with it, and
Great.
I think it's going to be a lot of fun to read when it's done. Because
Good.
I
keep in touch. Keep in touch with us, and we can review that when it comes out.
I'll make sure you get an early copy.
Very good. All right, Noble. I appreciate very much you coming on the show. We'll call it quits there, but as I say, we'll hopefully get you back sometime in the
All right.
in the future. And good luck with the next book.
Thank
All
you
the
very
best.
much.